record. Okay. Yep. Okay, I'm recording now. Okay, so what I was saying for last or the very first lecture of the semester, one thing that I wanted to attempt to do is go ahead and instead of spending my entire lecture block, ranting and lecturing over lecture slides where you just go ahead and listen to them. You can listen to my my video of them so that I can do interactive coding with you for this semester. And so with that said, the first lab that I've assigned to everybody is going to be one that's focused on HTML. Now, I had actually just rewritten this lab for this semester. The prior version of this lab use strictly HTML. And typically the way that the homeworks are based, the homeworks are derived off of the kind of activities we do in lab. And so there was a lot of students who wanted to get some kind of data persistence in their interactive story that they weren't able to because it wasn't shown how you might achieve that with strict HTML. Strict HTML doesn't allow for any data persistence. So I use a little bit of embedded JavaScript in this lab strictly for the purpose of opening up options for you when you go to design your own interactive story. So in this lab, we're going to learn HTML. We're going to learn HTML by actually building an application. And the application we're going to build is going to be what I'm going to call a interactive story. So it's a story like a choose your own adventure story, so to speak, where you get to decide the action and then you have branching pathways and then you could either die or you get to some conclusion. So I think that's a good use case of an app that's strictly kind of HTML only. Okay, hang on. Someone became unmuted. Let's take participants. Let's see. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now let me go. So this document should already be available in Moodle as a PDF. And then when it comes time to submit, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the end of the document. Okay, so the first page that we're going to go through is going to be the table of contents. And so the way that all of the labs are going to be structured is it's going to be about building an application using the technology we're covering inside the lectures. So the first lecture is about HTML. So we are going to build an HTML related application. The next lab is going to be CSS. So we're going to build something that uses CSS, a lot of CSS. The next lecture would be about Twitter, Bootstrap. So it would be to go ahead and design a web page, a responsive web page using Bootstrap. The next lecture would be probably about the introduction basics of JavaScript. So we'd start to build a lab using JavaScript. And your homeworks are going to be derived off of kind of like that lab content. Okay. So with that said, here you can see this particular lab is broken down into 12 different goals. Each one of these goals is essentially an iterative approach on how our software is going to get built. So we'll see more of that as we actually start to walk through this lab. But so these labs are intending to do multiple things. The first of which is to go ahead and show you a technology that you're going to be able to use to build out your web applications. But another approach of these labs is to show you how you can start with nothing, how to start with nothing but an idea, a concept, and how to grow it into a full-sized application using kind of an iterative design strategy, where we'll go ahead and build based off of a concept and keep adding more complexity until we get where we want to be at. And so here, each one of our complexities is going to be like goal 1 is going to be to add an index page. Goal 2 would be to add the intro page. Goal 3 would be like an inventory page. You'll see we're building a new web page, an HTML document for each of these goals. Okay, so let's move to our introduction. So what do we need to know for this particular lab? Not much. This lab is essentially supposed to be self-contained, so there's no prereqs, and all we need is like a Chrome browser. Chrome is going to be the browser that I'm going to do all the testing on. You're free to use any other browser, but you have to make sure that it does work in Chrome. And if it works in Firefox, if it works in Safari, if it works in Edge, it should work in Chrome. We'll need a code editor. So I'm going to use a probably my Visual Studio Code, and then a GitHub account. And you can create a GitHub account for free. The reason why you will need a GitHub account is for being able to deploy your HTML web pages, your static web pages, to the internet so that it actually has a live URL. Okay, so what's the motivation behind this lab? To understand how to author multi-page HTML websites using the HTML syntax. Perfect. And what's our goal? Well, it's to build an interactive story. So the motivation is to learn this. The goal is to actually build something. And so here where the reader chooses their own path. Okay, and our learning objectives, the things that we're looking to get out of this lab by the time we're done with it, is to learn the structure of an HTML file, to learn what HTML elements are and what attributes are. No, just to confirm, we're going to use GitHub, not GitLab, not the CS GitLab. We'll be using GitHub. So let's check this out. So GitHub. So if you haven't seen it before, and I think this might be inside, I think I do have a lecture on this. I'll have to double check. But if you go to github.com, go, and if you haven't created an account here, create an account. And this is, it looks very much like GitLab. This is what we'll be using to go ahead and publish our web content. Okay, let's see. We're going to learn objectives, learn about the HTML elements and attributes. We're going to learn about HTML inputs, and we're going to learn about embedded JavaScript. We're going to learn what the distinction between a block level versus an inline level element is. We'll talk more about script tags and how we can embed JavaScript logic into an HTML page with script tags. And this is given this kind of cheating a little bit. But we're gonna use a minimal amount of JavaScript, and we'll learn much more about JavaScript when we get to that section. We're going to learn about URL search parameters or query strings. That's going to allow us to transfer the state of one of our pages to another page in case you want to make an interactive game that requires you to continually accrue some kind of data or resource or whatnot for your character. And then we'll learn how to deploy a static website onto GitHub. Okay, so let's see here. The project architecture for this particular project is we'll have a root directory. We'll call it, say, for instance, adventure story. Inside the adventure story is going to be assets that are given to you that you will need for this lab. You can get these assets either from Moodle, from the starter files, or you can just follow this link. I'm just going to follow this link because it's easy. So I'm going to copy this here, and I'm just going to go and paste it into the browser. Here we go. And what you're going to see is, it's going to download a 19 meg zip file. Okay, so I'm going to hop back on over here, and while that completes, okay, perfect. Okay, so concepts. So the critical concepts that we're going to really cover today is HTML is the standard markup language for creating web pages, and HTML stands for hypertext markup language. So HTML describes the structure of a web page, and HTML consists of a series of elements. And typically what we're doing with HTML is we're going to define our app's view, or essentially what gets rendered in the web client's viewport. So every time you see anything that gets rendered as a web page in the browser, that's the viewport. Above the viewport is your navigation tabs, where you can navigate between multiple web pages. You have a URL tab here where you can put in the pathway to an HTML document. One of the beautiful things about web browsers is it can open up HTML documents either from local either from your local file storage or from a HTTP request. And then it's the role of the browser to go ahead and parse the HTML document and essentially display it in a way that looks pleasant. Like, for instance, notice some of this text will render larger than other text. Okay. So then HTML, the components of HTML we're going to derive words off of is going to be HTML elements, and an HTML element is defined by a start tag. It has some content in between, and it has some end tag. And HTML elements will tell the browser how to display the content. You have HTML attributes, which can provide additional information about HTML elements. Attributes are declared with a start tag. When we were talking about block elements versus inline elements, a block element always starts on a new line and takes up the full width, the horizontal space of whatever gets rendered. And an inline element uses the existing line and only takes up as much width as necessary. And the typical structure of an HTML file is your root element. So first of all, you can think of an HTML document as a tree-like structure. It's like a tree-like data structure. The root node, the root element would be the HTML element. It would have two children elements, one that will be called the head element and the other that's called the body element. The head element is a container for metadata, so data about the HTML document itself, but not data that's supposed to be shown to the end user. Metadata is not displayed, and it typically defines the document's title, maybe your character or font set. It could be your styles, it could be your scripts, whereas the body will define the document's body. And it can contain all the content of an HTML document meant to be viewed, such as the headings or the paragraphs, images, hyperlinks, all that other stuff. Let's see. We have our web client, and our web browser. So I kind of mentioned that previously. That's what an HTML document is opened by a web browser. And so we can open up HTML documents in one of two different protocols, either the HTTP protocol. So typically when you type in http://www and goes to some web address that's using that protocol, that's the preferred protocol to use. You also have the file protocol, but just understand the file protocol is a little bit more limited. So you might not be able to do everything functionally with your HTML document as you could with HTTP protocol, and they do that for security reasons. Okay. In addition to being a HTML document parser and viewer, browsers also have JavaScript runtime environments, which we'll actually make use of for this lab, very minimally, just to be able to share our data. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to build an interactive story. If you want inspirations of what an interactive story might look like, I actually give you an example link here. And actually, let's go on over and let's see where that goes. Okay, yeah, so this is just a collection of games that are all tagged as interactive fiction. And if you want to go through and actually play some examples, there's plenty on here. Okay, but I'm not going to bother doing that. Nope, not going to go bother doing that for that. Okay, so goal 0 is the actual design of our interactive story. Okay, let's actually, before we get to any of the goals, just so that everyone has a solid, firm understanding of what we're building, why don't we test out what the final application is going to look like? So let me open up a browser here. Can everyone see my screen, by the way? Perfect. Okay. Okay, so now let me go here. This is here, here, and it's going to be index.html. Okay, so pull that in here. Okay, so when we first launched our application, I should also illustrate, if I could just double click too, because the default application for open up HTML documents is the browser. Okay, so when we first launch, we're building an HTML adventure game. We have a little bit of text here, and we have an image. And one nice thing about browsers is it supports animated GIFs, so you can get a little bit more motion in your images if you use a looping GIF, which is what I used here. I'm going to click the start button. Okay, it's going to bring me up to my story introduction. That gives me the little blurb of my story. Welcome, traveler. Our land is plagued by great evil. Please save us. Here, take 5 golds as a deposit. So let's adventure out of town. I'm just going to go to our overworld, and notice here I have an inventory. So this represents the data persistence we'll be able to achieve. I have 5 gold, which was given to me at the intro. I have 3 hearts, health. I have 1 attack power, and I have 0 keys. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go into the shop. Here inside the shop, we have the ability to buy health or buy attacks or buy keys. I can't buy the key yet because I only have 5 gold, but I could say, for instance, get health if I want it. Okay, I get an attack if I wanted to. Okay, let's exit out there. Let's go into the forest. If I go into the forest, I can either go into the hills or I can go into the swamp. If I go to the hills, I'm going to get into some kind of fight where I have the option to either fight or retreat. Let's retreat out of there. I can go into the swamp. Notice each time I go, I have the same data that's following me around. When I go into the swamp, let's see, it gives me some choices. I can either go into the hut or I can go outside. If I go to the hut, that's a locked door. Probably why I need a key. So I can exit out of there. Exit out of there. Let's see here. If I go into the swamp again, but try to go outside the hut, that's going to lead to a death screen. So that's an end state that brings me back to the beginning. I got eaten by an alligator. Okay, so let's see. If I go to the dungeon, there's some kind of riddle here. I got to type in some kind of word that dispels this runic spell. Let me just put hello. Nope, that was the wrong one. So that's also an example of how I get to an end state. And then presumably I can go and like try to fight the goblin right there. Yeah, see, we fight the goblin and it looks like game over. So that gives you just a quick example of what we're going to be building today. And so when we go to build this, notice what's happening is we're linking a lot of our HTML documents one after the other with these hyperlinks. So the first thing you should do, oh, sorry about that. Didn't mean to put jump scares into the game. Okay. The first thing you should do, though, before you start designing or implementing any application, or whether it's a web application or a desktop application or even a web page, is to figure out what is going to be the flow from one portion of the application to the next. So especially if you're building an interactive story. So I gave you like an adventure idea, but I think this project would lend itself really well with like some scary ideas too, like a scary story, as apparently this one already has the effect of making people jump. So going back to what we had here, we started at the index page and that flows into the intro page, right? So, and from the intro page, we then go to the overworld page. And then the overall page, notice this has a 2-headed arrow instead of a single-headed arrow. The single-headed arrow represents going from one page to the other, but without having the option to go back. So the index brings us to the intro brings us to the overworld. The overworld gives us the option to go to the dungeon, the forest, or the shop, and all of those can go back to the overworld. Now, if we go to the dungeon can lead us to the dragon, and the dragon will be the end of the story, so that would bring us back to the index page. Now, the forest can bring us either to the swamp or that goblin fight. The goblin fight can either bring us back to the forest if we win, or if we lose, we go back to the index, the start of the game. Now, if we go into the swamp, we have the option to either go outside the hut or inside the locked hut. If we go outside the hut, again, that's our other losing condition, so that brings us back to the index page. Whereas if we get into the locked hut, if we have the resources, it gets us inside, and then we can get back out, double arrow, get back out. This should have a double arrow, so that's an error inside this document. And then finally, the shop allows us to go in and out. So this is just a flow chart that describes how we're going to flow each scene in our interactive story, and each scene is represented by an HTML document. So when designing your own interactive story, each scene should either lead to a branch or a dead end, and it's beneficial to have multiple branching paths to converge into similar paths. So you should start by writing your story branches out before you start designing your HTML documents. Okay, now with that said, let's actually get into implementing. So for the purposes of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste the code, but I'm going to explain it each step of the way as I do that. That way we can try to get through this document all within this lecture period, if possible. So each of our goals represents one thing we want to achieve with our application at a time. So we're not going to try to build that entire game all at once. We're going to focus on, say, just the index page. Now, every web page and every web application should have some index.html. That's like the launch point of your application, of your web page. It should be the first landing space, the landing page that all end users are going to go to. So our first goal will be to have an index.html page. So we're going to break our goals down into three phases: a approach phase, or what I like to call the design phase, the implementation phase, which will be to apply the concepts that we've defined in our approach, and then we'll have a testing phase where we assess to ensure that everything that we intended to build for this goal is working the way we expect it to. So you can think of these as the 3 A's of development: having an approach or designing, applying your approach, which is implementation, and assessing the approach, which is testing. Excellent. Okay, so our first goal is to define the initial index page where the player starts. All scenes in this interactive story use HTML in order to define all our HTML elements, and we'll talk about them as we start that out. So before we can start writing HTML documents, we need to actually create an HTML file. So let's go over here. So no, don't want to go. Okay, so I'm going to open into this tab. Let's see here. I'm going to create a new, actually, I have this file I downloaded, remember? Let's drag that in. Okay, so this is going to be the initial, no, not that. Let me unzip that. Perfect. Okay, so now I have all these assets and stuff. Now, this probably also has like some Git files in there. So if you want to separate some hidden Git files in there, and actually, let's see, I could prove this to you. New terminal at folder, since I downloaded this off of GitHub. Let me see, present working directory. Yep. Okay, let me do it. Oh yeah. Okay, let me. Yeah, see, so we have like a git ignore file and probably some other things in here. I'm fine with that though. So let's clear this. Okay, so when I first download the zip file, notice it's going to have all of the art assets that we're going to need for this project. So that's where those are going to come at. Those are all going to be inside of the assets folder. So I want to be in the root directory here, this one. And I'm going to, no, stop that. Okay, there we go. I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so HTML adventure story. So this is going to be, and let me clear this. Oh, perfect. Okay. So now it should be an HTML adventure story. Perfect. Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to create a index.html page. Perfect. And now if I go to open that in a text editor, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. We start with a blank file. And what we're going to do as step one is define the HTML element. So I'll copy this and explain what it is. So let's go ahead and paste this in here. So HTML element. So we have an open tag. We have a close tag. We need a close tag. So open tags are in between these angled brackets and the root document, the root elements HTML. The closing tag is going to have a slash and then whatever that tag is. And then we can put content in between. We could put other HTML elements or text in between an HTML element. So like I said, this is a tree-like structure, and the children of our HTML elements, which allows essentially the browser to know, hey, this is the contents of the HTML, this is the beginning and the end of the HTML, will be the head tag and the body tag. Okay, so at this point, we have an HTML document. Let's actually go ahead and actually open it up over here. Perfect. There's not going to be much there. In fact, I can also just double click it. Okay, but we haven't implemented anything in there. So the next step will be, well, let's add some content to the head. The content I want to add to the head is going to be a favicon and a title. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab this. I'm going to grab the favicon and the title, and then we're going to talk about it. So remember, I said that the head element contains metadata, so not something that's supposed to be directly displayed to the end user, but it's data that, or resources that are required by this HTML document to render the way it's supposed to be rendered. So when I say a title, what the title is if I go back over here and if I refresh the page, notice I have a default favicon. The favicon is a little icon that appears on a tab. The title is the name that appears on a tab. So if I define a title inside of the head, so here I have a title element, and so I have the opening tag, I have the closing tag, and in between the open and closing tag, I'm just going to put the text adventure game. So now if I go ahead and hit refresh, notice all of a sudden the title changes to have on the tab changes to have the name that I put here, and then I can do a link element, and a link element is a special type of element that does not need a close tag. It just needs an open tag because it can never have content in between it. And so this link element will put what its relation it is. It's an icon, and its hyperreference is going to go into the assets directory, and it's going to go to the dragon logo PNG. So inside my assets directly, I have this dragon dash logo PNG. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to link it as the icon for the tab. And so these are attributes, right? So when you have these assignments inside of a head tag like that, then that's the attributes that are set for that element. And so sometimes these attributes have to define like a source or hyperreference or something just to tell the browser where to go to find that data. And so that's going to allow me to render my own little logo there.
Professor, in the lectures, whenever we linked something, we would use a instead of the word link. Which one is more commonly used? Is it link or a?
Well, that's a great question. There are actually two different elements. So in order to link to this document a favicon, we have to use the link element. But typically inside of the body of an HTML document, when you want to hyperlink from either one part of the page to another part of the page or to a whole nother HTML document, you use what's called an anchor tag. And so the A is short for anchor tag. So the we can't use anchor tags to embed this logo, though. The only way we can embed a favicon is using the link element. And so these are the kinds of things, these kind of nuanced distinctions where it might seem obvious that you can create a hyperlink with a link element, where you can't. You have to use the anchor element to create a hyperlink. Like these are the things that you'll really pick up more by just building your own HTML content. But great question. I'm glad you asked that. So
Thank you.
the only way.
Clarification.
Okay, so then let's go into, okay, so now that we have our head the way we want, let's go ahead and implement the body. Now the body's going to be a lot bigger because we're going to actually use a lot of HTML elements here, and I'll step through all of them after I go ahead and paste them. Now, what I would recommend to you is to actually type all this out and don't do it the way I'm doing it, which is copy pasta in. And the reason why I prefer to type it out, for you to type it out, is it'll build up the your memory or experience of having to type it out, and that process is a learning process that'll make you much better acquainted with all these tag names and the structuring of your elements. Notice how I'm tabbing everything over, so it's very easy for me to see where the beginning of an element starts and ends at. And in fact, you could see inside of my code editor here, it even draws a vertical line to show me the start and end. And so just like a set of curly braces in Java, right, it shows me the scope of each element. So I would prefer for you to actually type these out, but for purposes of time, I'm going to go ahead and copy paste them. So inside of our body, now remember the body tags are really designed to hold all the content that's supposed to be rendered into the browser's viewport. And so H1 is a heading. It's the biggest heading we can have inside of our elements. So that's going to create a big, bold piece of text that will represent the title of our game. HR stands for horizontal rule. It'll allow us to go ahead and render a horizontal line. And both the H1 element and the HR are what we'll call block level HTML elements, which means that after this renders, it'll be the only thing on that horizontal line. So it'll create a new line as if I hit the return key and before rendering the next thing under that. And so then we're going to do a horizontal line, and then we're going to do a paragraph element. So a paragraph element uses the P as its tag, and then I can put content between my my paragraph here. Beware, here be monsters. Then after I go ahead and give a small description, I will go ahead and use an image element. Now, an image element is just like the link element, the fact that it is it's a self-contained element, does not need a closing block because you can't embed content in between an image, right? You're just trying to embed the image into the HTML document. Now, this slash is traditional, but it's optional. If you don't put it there, the browser will put that in there. So I want to highlight, you can either put so this is classically what is correct. When you have a single tagged element, you open and close it in the same set of angled brackets in the same tag. However, if you don't do that, it's fine. So our image requires a source attribute, and the source is going to be where in your file system is your image actually located. So that's a file path. So, and this is in relation to where the HTML document itself is at. So since our HTML document, the index.html document is located inside of HTML Adventure Story here, since it's located right there, we can use a relative path to say, okay, well, inside the directory I'm already at is an assets directory, and inside the assets directory will be this game title.gif. And then I can also specify a width. If I don't specify a width, it'll use the native width of the image. So if you want to force an image to be bigger or smaller, you can do that by just defining this other attribute. So I could also put a height in there as well. Okay, here's an example of how I can even start nesting HTML elements. I can create a paragraph element. And the reason why I want to create a paragraph element is that I'm embedding into it an anchor element. And so an anchor element, as you might recall, or maybe we haven't talked about this, so I'm going to say is an inline element. So if I want an element to have a block level like behavior, which means that it goes on its own line, then I can nest it in some block level element like a paragraph or a div. But anchors are normally going to, if there's another element that comes after them, it'll just do one after the other. Inside of my anchor element, I'm also going to nest a button. So the idea here is I will have a button that says start. When I press start, it's going to activate the anchor tag, and the anchor tag, when an event occurs on it, will go to whatever this hyperreference is. This hyperreference will bring us to the intro.html document. So it's going to bring us to a whole nother HTML document. Then after this paragraph, I'll do another horizontal line, and then I'll do another heading element. So the heading elements are going to be much bigger than the paragraph text. The paragraph text will be rendered in like a 12 font, it's the typical content you're going to find, but the headings will be like your headers that go above that. So here, I just want to put the story and code is by the author here, which is me. Okay, so if I save this, and if I go and just refresh my page, I should now get that start page like we had. Is there any questions about this?
Yes, I have one question. With the hyperlink, with the A hyperlink, with the href, you see how you have intro.html? Now,
That's right.
what if this page already exists for somebody else? Does it go to their intro.html or does it go to yours?
Well, so the intro HTML, since I'm not using an HTTP : and then www. some web address, since I'm not using a web address, it's going to use the file path. And since it's not using a, since it's using a relative file path, it's going to look just for this directory, right? So if I wanted to, I can make it do something like this. I could do this, www.google.com, right? So if I save that, since this is using the www protocol, when I click that, oh, let me do HTTP as well. Let's go back. Okay. There we go. So it knows to jump to the web because I'm using this HTTP protocol. And then I can give it a web address that can exist anywhere. Without that HTTP, and since I'm currently, if I click on here, oh, let me go back. Notice right here, it shows file. That means I'm in file protocol. Well, I'm in file protocol, it's just going to look in the directory I'm currently in. So let me go back to where it says intro.html, which doesn't exist yet, by the way, right? So actually, let me refresh this. So when I click on that, it's actually going to say, oh, your file couldn't be accessed. And the reason why it could be accessed is I didn't make it. In fact, let me make it really quick. Let me go back over here. Let me create the intro.html file. Okay, so now that it even exists, let me go back. Let me refresh. And if I hit start, now it actually can find it. There's nothing on there yet. We haven't written it yet, but notice it didn't give me an error message. Did that help answer your question?
Yes, because now I most definitely will look to see that there's the HTTPS anytime I'm clicking buttons on my web browser.
Oh,
making sure I'm
yeah.
going to actual websites.
Yeah, there's lots of nefarious things that can be had too. And we'll talk more about security implications of web applications as we go throughout the course. And of course, okay, so now what we're going to do is we go through that assessment phase. I think we already did this, though. So we opened the index.html in our Chrome browser, and we had that tab and the viewport should both display. So we saw the tab, yep, and we saw what this content in the browser. So now that my content that I've just implemented is in line with what is illustrated inside of this lab document, I can move on to the next step. I've completed this goal. I'm successful. So for goal 2, I want to build the intro page. So our second goal is essentially to introduce the story of our interactive game. So it's going to like introduce the character, or it's going to be like the starting action that's going to create the quest. Or if it's a scary story, maybe the thing that's going to be the source of inspiration of the scares, like the haunted house that you go walk into or whatnot. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly. Anchor tags are used. And so the idea behind the concept of an anchor tag is you're anchoring, it's like an anchor point of the HTML document to some other point. So which could either be in the document itself or it could be another HTML document. So we're going to start every HTML page the same way. We're just going to start with an HTML element. And inside that HTML element, we're going to add a head element and a body element. So let me go to my intro.html and let us go ahead and paste our code into there. So HTML element, we start with that, and we give it a head and a body. And we're going to do the same second step every time, which is going to ensure that this page also has inside of the tab adventure game and that logo. If I go now, look what happens right now. If I go, notice it goes to intro.html and then the default favicon. So if I go into my head and if I go and put in that title element and also put in a link element that has the relation of an icon and then links as a hyperreference to the logo we want to use, then when I refresh, there we go. So now Now that's going to be consistent. If I go back, my index.html and then my adventure game HTML will all have the same kind of user experience across the multiple pages. Okay, so now let's go to the body. And so the third step every time we go to design our HTML pages will then be to define the body, which is going to be all of the elements that are going to be rendered. So remember, the point of this page is going to be to go ahead and effectively, let me tab that in. I want to have these pretty late. I want all of my HTML documents to have pretty styling. The same way that you've learned how to style your documents in Java, you kind of want to do the same thing, have all the scope be indented within. Because then I could see the beginning and end of an element and easily see what's contained within. So just a quick readout of my elements. I have a heading element, a big heading element, a heading 1. So I could have a heading 1 and H1 and H2 and H3 and H4, H5 and H6, and they progressively get smaller for each of those heading elements. So here I'll have essentially the heading of this scene. I'll then have a horizontal rule, a horizontal line. Then I'm going to have an image that depicts what's happening in this scene, and then a paragraph that describes to our player the intro of our story. So here it's just a quick welcome, traveler. Our land is plagued by a great evil. Please save us. And then I'm going to give 5 gold pieces as a deposit. And then I'll do another heading element, which is going to have nested inside of there that anchor tag that will let the player click into the overworld.html file. So it'll go to another HTML document. And then by putting text in between the anchor tag, instead of revealing what the address is, we can give a description of where this is going to go. So this is going to then have a piece of clickable text that says adventure out of town. Okay. So let me click on here and see. Oh, yeah. So there's our heading 1 element. And then this is our horizontal line. And we have the embedded image here. And then we have our paragraph here, and then that's our hyperlink. And notice our hyperlink has a heading 4 element, right? It's bolder than the normal text because we have the anchor tag, right, nested in between the heading 4. And then if I click on Adventure Out of Town, it's going to bring me to a page that does not exist. Excellent. So there's not much different between this goal and the last goal, just illustrating how we can link between 2 different HTML documents, and we can put all sorts of media in our documents. So it's not just text, but we can have, and not just hyperlinks, we could do lists, we can do tables, which we're about to go see how to do. We could do images, we could do video, we can embed video, and we can embed audio. And we'll do all of that over the course of this lab. Yeah, so we don't need to, in fact, we can have some really ugly looking HTML. I can get rid of I can have it all go across one line, and the browser will be able to parse it, but we won't be able to read it well. So it's the same reason why we do indentations on code. It's for readability for developers, and not necessarily because the application requires it. Okay, I'm happy with that. Okay, so let's move on to goal 3. So in goal 3, this is going to be our inventory page. So this page displays the player's inventory. The HTML documents normally can't share data between each other. And so this is one reason why this concept of a single page application has evolved. And we'll talk more about what SPAs are and progressive web apps later. But one reason why we've moved away from multi-page pages into single pages is to maintain or data persistence in the JavaScript runtime environment. However, this lab, you're not going to do that. So we need to find an alternate way to be able to get data from one web page to another. And there is a way to transmit data between web pages using what's called a query string, which is embedded at the end of a URL. So if we look at the anatomy of a URL, it might look something like this. So this might be, and this is an HTTP one, but this could be the same as a file pathway too of an HTML document. So we would have whatever the file path is to an HTML document. And then we could put a question mark after it. And the question mark is the delimiter between the web address and then the set of data that you want to inject into essentially the JavaScript runtime environment. And so then it's a key value pair where I can have a key and then set the value with an equal sign. If I have more than one sets of keys, I can combine them with a single ampersand. So let's take a look at how we could do that. Let's make an inventory.html page. So let me go back over here. Okay, let's open this up in here. Okay, and we'll also double click it so we can see what's happening as it evolves over time. Okay, so we're going to start our HTML document the same every time. We're going to start by defining the HTML element, and inside the HTML element, you need a head element and a body element. Okay, so once we have that, so the next thing we want to do is we're not going to actually, for our inventory page, create a title for it, because the way that we're actually going to use this in our game is we're going to create an iframe in other pages that's going to display this content. So we'll never actually directly access our inventory.html page. We're always going to indirectly access it while on another page. So we're just using this as a view into the content of what the player has. So let me go ahead and just grab really quick the body elements. So I'm going to leave the head blank then, and here I'm going to let me indent all this in so that it has the appropriate tabbing, and let me save this. Okay, so what's happening here? Oh Lord. Okay, so we have inventory, and notice I'm not wrapping that around anything, right? And then I'm going to do a horizontal rule. So when I go to look at this, it's going to be plain text word inventory, and then it's going to be a horizontal rule. And now I'm going to create a table. So a table you might want to think of as like a Excel table almost, right? Where you can have rows and you can have columns. So when you define a table element, tables can have TR elements. The TR is short for table row. So everything that goes between this TR, the open TR tag to the closed TR tag, will represent the content that goes into the table row. And then table rows can have either TDs, which is table data, or TH, which is the table head. And so there's a stylistic choice that's going to render by the browser based off of whether you do TH or TD. TH is going to kind of bolden whatever the content, whatever text is between that, because it's thinking that's your table header or your table heading. And TD is just going to display it as if it's a paragraph text. So it's not going to do anything special to it. Now, it's actually possible to embed emojis or Unicode characters into our HTML documents. We can use a special symbol of ampersand and then hashtag and then whatever the Unicode symbol is. And you can look this up. So for instance, if I wanted to find like the Unicode, and then I can even put in HTML if I want the HTML syntax for it, of, let's say, for instance, of a smiley face. I can just do a quick search, and okay, there we go. We can see here. Let's do something more interesting than a smile. Let's do like a dragon. Is there a dragon? Okay, so here we go. We have a dragon. So let me just click on this, the first hit that's on here. Let's see if it loads. Okay, so here you can see this would represent the hex encoding. You can either use the hex encoding or you could use the int encoding of this dragon here. And as long as you preface it with a ampersand and a hashtag, it can then render that symbol. Actually, let's do we could do money bag too. Okay, yeah, so yeah, that's probably what we're using right now to represent the amount of money you have. So that's just what's happening here. So this is going to be the Unicode character for a money bag. This will be the Unicode character for a heart. This will be the Unicode character for a sword. This will be the Unicode character for our key. And these are comments in HTML, by the way. So a comment can be embedded in HTML. It's a multi-line comment. It starts with what looks like this arrow with an exclamation mark in it as the beginning portion of a comment, and you end it with a arrow that's pointing in the opposite direction, dash, dash, and then the angled bracket. And then any content in between, as you see, is going to render green. It's not going to actually be parsed and displayed inside the viewport. Then what we're going to do is, so this is going to be our first table row. Then we're going to have a second table row, which is going to have the table data elements, TD elements. And in between each of those, we're going to start with 0, 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to assign an attribute, an ID attribute to each of these as a string. And string in HTML can either use double or single quotations. Just be consistent with it for opening and closing. And so here I'll give this the ID of GP for gold pieces. This will have the IP of HP, the ID for HP for health. This will have the ID of AP for attack power, health power, gold pieces, and then finally the keys. So you're supposed to line up here. So money, health, attack, and your keys. And then after I have the two rows, I will go ahead and close out my table element. And then I'm going to eventually embed some logic into this page. I can embed some JavaScript in between script tags. So if I go and just hit refresh now, you'll see, oh, that's what I have. Inventory in plain text along with the horizontal line. And then I have my emojis that render out. And then underneath it, because this is a table, right? Then underneath that, I have 0, 0, 0, 0. Perfect. So now let's see what we're going to add into that script tags. That's right. Now, and to prove this, let me put something like this. See how it by the TH for table heading, if there's any text in there, it would go ahead and it would bold it and make it bigger in font, as opposed to like this. However, emojis can never be bolded. Emojis don't have like font differences. You can only increase the size of them. Oh, no, cancel that. Okay. So now let's go into our script tag and let's go ahead and paste this in there.
I have a question.
Sure.
For the table, do you need to start it with a TH tag, or like does it need a heading tag?
No, it does not. The table does not need a TH. So I could have just made these TDs if I wanted to. And that's the only reason why I used THs here was because I wanted you to see the element existed. But then, of course, I put a text in there that didn't matter. So this would work just fine. You're never required to have a table heading. So if you wanted to make a table that represented like a chessboard or checkerboard and just navigate the things in between there, that's completely fine as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Now inside my script tag, I can actually put some imperative logic in there. So I can move away from the declarative paradigm that I'm stuck in with HTML and actually start to get some interesting algorithm design and whatnot here. But what I'll do here is I will be able to create a URL search parameter. So this is an API call, a JavaScript API call that all browsers support. So let's see what's actually happening here. Let me jump into my developer tools console here. Excellent. No, I did not want you to go. Oh, Lord. Let's collapse that down. Okay. So here we go. Okay, so here I'm going to open up my developer console. So if I type in location.search. First of all, let me say this. We have by default a window object available to us that has all of the settings and data for any given web page. And this is launched when a web page opens by the browser. one of the attributes of the window is what's called location. So that gives me the location information that's inside of the address bar here. There's actually an alias to that that's just called location. So if I type that, notice that's the same thing. Okay, so I have this location data that's available to me at the inside the JavaScript runtime environment that contains the address we're currently at. And in fact, if I type in and get the search attribute of that, think of this as an object. So this is an object. If I type in the search parameter, it will return back a string to me to say, oh, that's a search parameter at the end of your address. Now, I didn't put in a search parameter at the end of this, right? But if I put a question mark, and let's say I put something like GP is equal to 5, right? So gold pieces is equal to 5, and let's do that ampersand. And let's say I do HP is equal to 3. Okay, and then let me do that and let's say I do that attack power is equal to 1. Well, there's that one more. Let's do keys, and keys is equal to 0. Okay, let me now reload the page. And the page looks like it loaded just like before, but now if I go and type in location.search, notice it returns back to me the search parameter that was fed into accessing this page. So now I actually get the question mark and then all of those attributes I just typed in. So let's say then I'm going to create something. So right, this is just a string. If I wanted to access it as if it were a data structure, like it were in Java or JavaScript or Python or any other programming language, I could take this string, this search term, the search parameter, and I can instantiate a URL search params object from it. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. Let's do this one single line inside of the console. So here I'm going to declare a variable using the keyword var. And I'm going to give this variable name queryString. And I'm going to assign into this variable a new instance of a URL search parameter that is this location, this location.search. So here now, what do I have? I now have a URL search params. And so this has getter methods. So I can say, for instance, queryString.get, and I can do get, and I can use whatever these keys are. So if the key was GP, it will now give me the value from there, 5. Or if it was HP, I can now get the value of 3. So it's parsing it for me. If it was the attack power, it's going to be that 1. And if it was the keys, it's going to give me that 0. And in fact, if I wanted to go ahead and notice it says strings here, if I wanted to parse it as a integer to actually do addition or something on it, I can kind of force cast by putting a plus sign in front of it. And so now notice that's an actual integer value. So if I did +1, it would actually add 1 to that. Whereas if I don't put that plus sign in front, there's other ways to cast. When we talk about when we actually get into proper JavaScript lessons, I'll show you all the different ways we can cast data. But here you could just see if you by default try to add 1, it'll do a concatenation operation, but we can force strings into number data by just putting a plus sign, because what it's going to try to do is just trying to give it a sign essentially.
Professor, what is this process called? Like I noticed when I did +1 to the query string, it didn't stay, it reverted back to 0. What is this like process called?
What do you mean?
Like I mean, I noticed that when we're in programming in text editors, we're programming text editors. Here, this console, is this really like programming or is it searching?
This is such a great question, and one that I hadn't anticipated answering yet. Usually I cover this when we actually get into JavaScript. But since I rewrote this lab to actually use a little bit of embedded JavaScript, that I'm kind of trying to give you an idea of what this code is doing by jumping into the console, I guess this is a great time for me to lead with the idea that usually you can divide programming language into one of two kinds of categories. You have compiled languages and you have scripting languages. And so with a compiled language, when you are in your text editor and you go ahead and you build all your source code, you have to go through a compilation step that converts it into essentially bytecode or object code that is essentially the machine code, right? Your assembled instructions that will then be run. And once you've compiled it, like, you can't go and change the code. In scripting languages, there's no compilation step. So it's essentially, it parses a statement at a time and tries to execute them. Another name for a scripting language is usually called an interpreted language, because it interprets your statements one after the other. Now, one of the biggest criticisms about interpreted languages is that they're a little slower than compiled languages. But they can be very performant, and they allow you to really kind of test and evaluate your code base. So JavaScript as a interpreted language means that it can be fed code on the fly, and it'll go ahead and update the viewport based off of those instructions. And so that'll allow us to create kind of interactive code. I'll give you an example of that later on. Right now, I don't want to get too deep into the JavaScript, but I do want everyone to feel comfortable enough to be able to use it to build their interactive stories. But right now, all we're doing is this query string is the variable, and then we can just go ahead and invoke a get method with whatever the key name is to get those values. Did that answer your question, at least, between interpreted language and a compiled language and what we're doing inside the console? So this console is our runtime environment for JavaScript, and allows us, when we go and when we execute this script tags, this is essentially what it's running these instructions in. It's loading the instructions into the console for this tab. And every tab has its own JavaScript runtime environment that is different than all the other tabs. So every time you open up a browser window and a tab inside the browser window, each one of those windows has its own JavaScript runtime environment.
So when I think of the JRE, I should be thinking of this this dark screen that has all these like optional query strings that I can insert into.
Absolutely.
This is really okay. So this is the JavaScript runtime environment. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if you watch the lecture on browser tools or developer tools, I give a full rundown of all the different things you can use the browser for web app development. Okay, so now that we have this query string and we can get the data from the query string, well, do you remember how I gave an ID attribute to these HTML elements up here? Well, one of the advantages of giving an ID to an HTML element is as soon as I give it an identifier, I can now use that identifier as a variable name in the JavaScript runtime environment. So now if I type in GP, notice it grabs that element, right? If I type in HP, it grabs that element. If I type in AP, it grabs that element, and if I type in keys, it grabs that element. Okay, let me do a quick clear, because this is starting to get kind of filled up with content. Okay, so I can then go into GP and access the inner text. So let me type that again. So I have GP. If I go to GP dot and access the inner text, that's the actual value that's in between that HTML element. So if I do an assignment to that, let's say I assign it to 10, for instance, look, pay attention to this when I do this assignment. So right now it's 5, right? As soon as I hit enter, it now goes to 10. Right? So I can actually change the state, the value of what's inside that HTML document, I'm sorry, the HTML tags, by accessing its ID and then the inner text that's between the open and closed tags on there. So let me go back to 5. So what I want to do, though, is I want to give values to it on what's based off of those, off of the parameter string that's fed as part of the web address. So here, if I do get the value of GP from the query string and set GP to that, oh, well, actually, hang on. Let me do a refresh so that, it's already everything because we're parsing it. But so this won't do anything. But you can see that's why it's setting this to 5 and 3 and 1 and 0, because we built that query string, and then we're getting each of the keys, which is returning the value, and then we're setting the inner text to each of these elements to be what the value is inside there. Excellent. Oh, cancel that. Okay, is there any questions about this, or does this is the first kind of JavaScript, and this isn't covered in the lecture, so this is only covered in this lab, but does this make enough sense for everyone to at least kind of understand what's going on here?
Yes, will we be going over this specific console later on in the semester a little more too?
Oh yeah.
Or is this
yeah,
the final? Okay.
You're gonna live and breathe from this console when we get into JavaScript. Again, I had avoided actually showing off this console for the first 3 lectures last semester, but I decided to introduce it in fact the first lab in this semester, because for the homework there was a lot of students who wanted to be able to get this sense of shared data, and I thought this was a good opportunity to show search parameters and how you can have a multi-page application and share data between each page using that search parameter. And now when you go to some web pages, let's see, I don't know, and if you see that there's that question mark, then you know what that is actually doing, that those are search parameters that are either used to send data to the web server or for the web client to be able to parse and use in some kind of novel and interesting way.
As soon as you mentioned it, I did check Moodle, and after you're logged into Moodle, it actually has a question mark, and it has like an ID. It's I think it's prevalent on a lot of them.
Of course, yeah, it's a very common measure, and we'll learn other ways too. So yeah, I thought it was a fun way to add something, and I think get some better assignments out of this too. Okay, let's see. I won't have, and I'll let you know, we'll finish this up probably next week, so I won't be able to get through all of these goals here, but I want to get through at least one more, since I think it relates to what we were just doing. So at this point, we have it so that if I don't put in a search parameter, right, I don't get any values. And then when I do put in a search parameter, I get values, and whatever values are passed in. So that was our goal, to build an inventory page that we can go ahead and load data into and kind of parse it and use it in our web page. So let's move on to goal 4. And this will probably be the last goal that we're going to do for today's lecture, where we're actually going to go ahead and build our overworld scene. And our overworld scene is going to give the players a list of places to travel to. And we'll be able to use our script tags to pass that query string to all of the hrefs that we're going to link to. So that's going to be the approach. The trick is, as you accrue things, you want to make sure that this query string that we're using modifies over the evolution of your software. So we hard coded it here, but in the future, we're going to want to make the values of like 5 for gold, the value of health, right, the 3 here, the value of 1, and the value of 0 inside of the HTML document. We want that to be able to be variable data and not immutable. We don't want it to be constant. We don't want to hard code it. So let's see how we might go about doing that. Well, the first thing we should do, let's build an HTML document that represents the overworld. And as you recall from index to intro, we're actually linking to overworld from intro. So here, let's go and create touch overworld.html. Pull this into here. And let's start by giving it the HTML tags along with the head and body. So we're going to start everyone the same way. And then since this is actually going to be a page that's designed to be displayed in the browser directly, we're actually going to, oh Lord, am I starting to freeze? Test. Okay. Then we're actually going to do, okay, perfect. Okay, then we're actually going to grab the head element that we were grabbing before. So since this is going to be part of our actual interactive game, unlike the inventory page, which is going to be used by the other scenes, we'll go ahead and add that title and that. So let's go back here. Let's go back here. Let's go back a couple times. Okay, so let's go to Adventure Out of Town. Okay, perfect. So here we can see we have our title and our logo. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to grab the HTML elements that we wish to render into the viewport and put that into the body. Oh, let me get my tabbing correctly on here so it's easy to read. Okay, so in our overworld scene, this is the first like real scene after the introductory story. We will have a heading element, a big heading, a heading 1 element that says overworld. We'll do a horizontal rule. We'll embed an image that is an animated GIF of our overworld, and we'll set it to be the width of 480. Then we're going to use a heading 4 image to alert the player, hey, where do you want to go? And here we're going to create an unordered list. So an unordered, so we can create either ordered list, which is a numbered list, or we could do an unordered list, which is going to be use essentially dots. And each list, whether you use a UL or OL, will have list items or LI elements inside of them, and each LI element will produce either a number or a bullet point. And then we can embed an HTML element in there. It'll be an anchor tag that essentially allows us to hyperlink to a new HTML document, which will represent where the player could potentially go. So dungeon will link to dungeon.html, forest will link to forest.html, and shop will link to shop.html. Now remember, every time we go to send the player to a HTML file to another location inside of our application, inside of our interactive story, we're going to also have to add the search parameters to it so that we don't lose the player's data. We want the player to be persistent across every page, which means we have to do that inside of script tags. So in order to access these href elements, we have to also give these anchor tags an ID element so that we can access it inside the script, so that we can access it using the term dungeon or forest or shop. And so that's what's eventually going to go inside these script tags here. Then we're going to have our href, our horizontal rule, another horizontal line, and then we're going to do an iframe. And notice the iframe is going to go to the inventory.html page. So an iframe allows us to open up a little window inside of our current page to some other page. And so the source is going to be this other page. I'm going to give this an ID attribute too, so that I can access it inside my script tags. And then I can give this window, this little browser window, this iframe window, its own width and height. So before I put any scripts in there, if I were to go and just hit there, you can see this is my heading element. That's that horizontal rule. This is that animated GIF that's 480 pixels wide. This is my heading 4 element that gives the user the option of saying, hey, where do you go? And then this is that unordered list, right? So it uses bullet points. If I change this to OL, just so you could see, which would be ordered list, let me save that, it would all of a sudden become numbered. So that's how easy it is to switch between an ordered list and an unordered list. If I switch it back, I get my bullet points. Okay. Now each one of my bullet points is inside of the list items, and those are going to be hyperlinked. So when I go to right, that doesn't exist, but I should be able to click on each one of those, and it would try to go to forest.html, dungeon.html, shop.html. And then here is that iframe. So I have that other horizontal line, and then here's that iframe that I set to be 100 pixels by 125 pixels. And so this is what's giving us that view from inventory.html that we built earlier. Now notice we're not getting any data in there yet. In fact, we need to send that data to inventory in order to access it. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that inside the script tag. It's going to be pretty simple though, because what we can do, and I want to jump back into the console, developer tools. Okay, so I know that I can access, I have an element that has the the ID of inventory. So there that is, right? So one thing I can do here is if I go to that element inside the script tag, access it, I can access all of the attributes as if it were a class, I'm sorry, as an instance variable from this object. So if it has a source, right? This has an attribute of source. All right. Okay, there we go. We have an attribute of source right here. So I could do inventory.source, and look at that. It actually gives me the location of that. Now remember, if I do location.search, that, oh, let me do this. GP equals 10, for instance. Okay, refresh. So now I have that. And let me go back to inventory. Oh. Okay, and inventory.source. Okay, so now if I take inventory.source and I concatenate to it, let's say the location, nope, location.search, that string parameter, look what just happened. See what happened? It actually was able to send GP10, right? That's the search parameter. Is able to send that as part of this hyper reference. And since the inventory page is looking for those keys, it's actually going to be able to set that value. So that's exactly what I'm going to do inside my script tag. So inside here, I'm going to paste, or I'm going to add in this logic. And actually, let me tab it one more time, where the inventory, the HTML element that has the ID of inventory, it has a source attribute. I'm going to concatenate to it the search parameter string. I'm going to do the same thing to the anchor tags hyper reference to dungeon.html. I'm going to do the same thing to the anchor tag with the ID of forest. And I'm going to do the same thing with the anchor tag hyper reference to dungeon. So so what I'm doing inside this is I'm appending my query string from whatever I have at this page to all of the other pages that this page links to, so that I can share this data when we transfer control from this page to the next. Okay, one last thing I want to do here is when we go to this page initially, we should set up the search parameters, right? So we want to set search parameters for GP, HP, AP, and keys. So let me do that. Let me go back to intro. There, save that. And let's see, let's go back to index.html. Let's actually open this up. Let's go back. Let's go back. Okay, so here, starting from our beginning page of our game, I will start. I'm told I have 5 gold pieces. I will now go here and look at this. Oh, my inventory screen's working fine. 5, 3, 1, and 0. And if I hit dungeon, for instance, this doesn't exist, but let's take a look at the URL link. Yep, that worked. At the end of that URL link is the question mark, and then GP is equal to is 5, and HP is 3, and AP is 1, and keys is 0. So this is starting to build a mechanism where we can start taking and mutating the data and sending it, well, at least set the data and send it to all the hyper references. We'll see how to mutate it later on in this lab. But I'm out of time today, and so we are done with where we need to be for goal number 4. So we will pick up on Thursday at goal 5. But up till now, you can actually start working on this lab on your own. And in fact, if you run into any issues, you could ask me questions about it next class when we start working on it again. Yes, I will post this lecture up on Moodle as soon as it is done transcribing. Yeah, I don't want to spend too long, honestly, with the HTML and CSS and Bootstrap labs, because the more interesting content of this class is going to definitely be all things related to JavaScript. But it's super important for everyone to have strong concepts of HTML and CSS and just responsive web design before we move into JavaScript, so that you understand what some of our aims of JavaScript will be. But we'll play it by ear. We'll play it by, we'll see what happens on Thursday. Excellent. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day.